I recently built this beautiful Explorer style guitar, and since guitar making videos are always kind of popular on YouTube, I thought it would be fun to take you guys along on the journey and show you the whole process. This is the third guitar that I've ever built from scratch, so I do not have a lot of experience, and it's been a couple of years since I've done so. So it's probably been 6 years or so since I've built the last guitar, and I remember the last ones not coming out too great, as there are lots of mistakes that you can make along the way. So with this project, I really took a lot of time planning everything and every single step, and I'm pleased to say that I'm very happy with the result. Before we start with the building process, I briefly wanted to talk about the inspiration of this project. I've been a fan of Hamer guitars for quite some time, and in case you don't know, Hamer was an American guitar brand from the 1970s. They made some very high quality custom shop level guitars for a lot of artists at the time, and their flagship model was called the Hamer Standard. It's called Standard, but it has the very non standard Explorer shape, which had the signature look of having a flamed maple top and a binding, and also the double cream in the bridge and the zebra in the neck. So that was kind of the Hamer signature thing. Some of them had crown inlays and the bound neck too. Those were called bound and crown. These are particularly sought after today. And the standard ones only had the dot inlays and no binding on the neck. There are a lot of people that played these guitars at the time, like Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick or Dave Hubeck from Rolly Hatchet, and I think Paul Stanley from Kiss also had a Hamer Standard. So these were quite popular guitars, and today they are very rare and sought after. So if you look at Reverb, I think there's only one or two from that period available right now. One of them is listed at 15 grand. I mean, this one has been online for a lot of years now, so it's probably not worth 15 grand. But when they do show up, they tend to sell at somewhere between, say, 5 to 7 grand or so. So these are quite expensive vintage guitars. And just a couple of days ago, a Hamer Standard owned by Gary Moore listed. So Gary Moore also played some Hamer guitars in the 80s, I think, and this seems to be his Hamer Standard, which is a particularly beautiful example. If you look at the flame top and the beautiful Honduras mahogany back, which is just gorgeous. Anyway, this is what inspired me to build this style of guitar, especially since you can't seem to find an Explorer with a flame top today for some reason, but it is a combination that I do think looks absolutely great, so I thought I would build my own. I was still waiting for some stuff to arrive, so I started with the fretboard and the inlays. I had these mother of pearl pieces that I used to cut out these custom shaped inlays. I call them wing inlays because they kind of look like a wing. I used a metal saw to roughly cut out the shape. There was no way I could get through this with a jeweler saw. The mother of pearl was probably 2 millimeters thick. Then there was lots of filing and some more filing, and finally some sanding. This is what the inlays looked like. It was a lot of work. It took probably a whole morning to get these done. Also because some of them broke while I was working on them. This mother of pearl stuff is some very hard and brittle material, and if you're not careful you'll break it while you work on it. So I had to start over a couple of times, which was very frustrating. And also quite frustrating was the fretboard blank that I bought. It's Indian rosewood, but it was totally warped. It had a thickness of around 11 millimeters or 10 millimeters, and I was somehow lucky to straighten it out without thinning it down too much. I used my router to straighten it out and to plane it down, because I don't own an electrical plane. So I have this little jig where I can put my router on the top part and just run it across those metal bars in a straight line, and thereby planing down the surface, which is a method that I used a lot during this build. I didn't take a picture of the warped fretboard. I should have to show you, but I kind of forgot to do it. Anyway, this is how the fretboard looked after I planed it down and after I sanded it. To make some parts of the build a little easier, I bought a routing template set from a German supplier, which also came with a template for the fretboard. So I first cut out the rough shape of the fretboard with a saw, and then used a router with a pattern bit to get it to the perfect shape. The next step was to put the inlays in, and I first copied the shape of the inlay using a scalpel blade, so I could later know where to chisel out the slot for the inlay. I then used, I think it was a 3mm chisel, to deepen the cut of the outline of the inlay, so I could hopefully get a somewhat straight edge and make it fit as good as I can. And I then started to chisel out the inlay slot, so doing this by hand is kind of messy and you will never get a perfect result doing it, but I think this is the way this has been done traditionally, and you will just later fill up the missing pieces with some sawdust and super glue. So this is how the slot looks. It looks kind of messy, I know, but it will end up looking fine, don't worry. So I put the inlay in. Make sure it's all the way in so that there's no air pocket underneath. Then I use a generous amount of CA glue. CA glue is super thin, so it will wick all the way in there, also underneath, which is why I first put in the inlay and then the glue. And then I sprinkle some rosewood sawdust over it, and I rub it in with my fingers to fill all of the little gaps at the edges. And later I seal everything in with another layer of super glue. I first put in the inlays before cutting the fret slots, because when you chisel out the inlay slots, there's a tendency to chip right through into a fret slot, which is very annoying, so it's safer to do it this way around. I then used a special fret slotting saw to cut the fret slots. And having the inlays and the fret slots done, I sanded down the fretboard. This is the result, especially how the inlays looked. As I said, doing this by hand, you'll never get to a perfect result. So if you get really close, you will be able to see that there are little gaps that have been filled and that it's not perfect. But from a feet away or so, it looks pretty neat and tidy. Then the fretboard got its radius. I used a 12-inch radius block to sand the radius onto the fretboard. 12-inch because it's typical for a Gibson style guitar, and I chose a Gibson scale length for this guitar too. I used some white marker to mark the fretboard so I could see if there were any spots that I might have been missing. And later on I used a straight edge just to make sure that the whole fretboard is actually totally straight. Because it did turn out that there was some kind of bow that I sanded into it using the radius block. So I really had to use the straight edge, otherwise it would have been a huge problem later when fretting the board. Of course the fretboard needed some side dots. I used a 2mm drill and a washer as a sort of depth guide to center the hole. I think it's really important that these are centered or in a straight line, otherwise it just looks kind of wanky. I glued them in using some super glue. I cut them flush. Filed them down a little bit. and then sanded the side of the board. This is how the fretboard looked, with the inlays and the side dots installed and the fret slots cut. I decided to do something that's probably a little unusual, which is to fret the fretboard before gluing it onto the guitar. The reason why I wanted to try it this way was because in the past, as I said, I have built 2 guitars before, and fretting has always been an issue for me, so I've never been satisfied with the fret jobs I did in the past. And I thought that if I do mess up, I would rather mess up at an early stage of the build rather than later when the whole guitar is almost finished. So I just wanted to give it a try, and also I thought that some parts of the fretting process might be a bit more convenient when there's not a guitar that's in your way, like hammering in the frets, for example. So I gave it a try, and before you lose your minds, I can spoiler you a bit and say that everything came out perfectly fine in terms of fretting, and I personally would really prefer this method to the other method of fretting it when the guitar is completely assembled. And for fretting, I bought some Hosco stainless steel fret wire, which was pre-cut, so it's pre-cut to just the right size, so you don't have to cut it yourself, which is very convenient with stainless steel, because stainless steel is quite tough to work with. And these frets are undercut, so they have the little cutaway for a binding if you have one. My fretboard doesn't have a binding, but that's not an issue. The fret tanks are still long enough, and I can just fill the gaps with sawdust and super glue, and it will look very neat because you will not see the metal edge of the fret on the side of the fretboard. I really do like that look. You will later see what I mean. And I prepared the fretboard by filing in the fret slots with a triangle file a little bit to help the frets to center themselves. And I then started fretting it using a plastic hammer, hammering in the stainless steel frets. It took a lot of force to get them in there, so that was another point where I was glad that I was doing it before the fretboard was sitting on the guitar, because it allowed me to be a lot more shameless in terms of hammering on the fretboard. After a fret was in, I would seal it in with some super glue from the sides. And as I said, the frets are undercut for a binding, so there's a bit of a gap there, which I then filled with some rosewood sawdust, and then I sealed that in with some super glue. With every single fret, I took my time to make sure that I hammered it in all the way so it was sitting flush against the fretboard, thereby making sure that I wouldn't have to level off too much of the frets later on. So at this point the fretboard was basically finished, and just to avoid some confusion, the fretting happened a little later on in the project when I had already built the neck, and I also drilled some centering holes for some toothpicks to put into the fretboard through the neck, so I could use that to keep the fretboard in the right position as I would later glue it onto the neck. So I didn't skip that step, but I thought I would show the fretting at this point in time because it kind of makes sense chronologically. Yes, and building the fretboard was very labor intensive. It took at least 2 or 3 whole days, like including the fretting and preparing the frets and all that. So that was a very big part of this build. I hope you enjoyed this video. So this was the first part of this Explorer build. It will probably be maybe 3 or 4 parts in total. I will upload the next part in a week, maybe in 2 weeks, depending on when I will find the time to record it. Anyway, so if you enjoyed this and you don't want to miss the next one, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.